Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we are going to be discussing the worst possible major for getting into a top college. So, before I get into that, a couple of caveats and prefaces here. So, first of all, we're talking about only from the perspective strategically of getting into a top college. I'm not talking about career earnings or a medium income 5 years out from college or et cetera, et cetera. Only talking about from a pure strategic perspective, the sort of most unadvantageous major or sort of admissions hook under which you could apply to competitive colleges if that is your goal, getting into a top college. And that is a lot of what we are discussing on this podcast. Everything is seen through the prism of strategically what you would do if you wanted to give yourself the greatest probability of success of getting into a top and highly selective college. So that's the first caveat here. Second off, I do want to just slightly distinguish between major and hook. So a hook, an admissions hook, is not the same thing as a major or even a set of majors. So when I say a set of majors, that could be something like in the common application, a school allows you to put three majors that you're applying under. Sometimes it's two, sometimes it's only one. In some cases, there actually isn't even a major selection per se. Most colleges will have a major selection, but a hook is not a major per se. They are related to each other, but they're not the same thing. So a hook is a defined passion. It's a defined through line, a story, a narrative that runs throughout all of your sort of candidacy building, right? Particularly your resume building, what you do outside of the classroom. That's not the same thing as a major. Now, what's going to happen is you will be building a hook. You will have some passion. And all these top colleges, as I've mentioned before, are pretty much agnostic. They're indifferent as to what it is. There are different strategic implications, as we'll get into, in this episode. A hook can basically be any sort of passion, any focus, anything that you've sort of devoted yourself to. But when it comes time to actually applying to college, you're now going to need to take that passion or that focus and you need to actually convert it into what it actually looks like to be a member of the incoming freshman class at that college, what it looks like in terms of what you'd be studying, what it looks like inside the classroom, in terms of what courses you would take, what professors you would study under. It also needs to manifest outside the classroom in terms of what research you would potentially partake in, what principal investigators, sort of whose labs you would be working in, what clubs you would be running, founding, being a leader of or joining. So a hook eventually needs to get sort of instantiated more or less in terms of what it actually looks like at that particular college, right? And the majors might slightly change, the minors, the certificates, the double majors, the different majors that you're putting in the application, the classes that you're mentioning. So a lot of this calibration or this sort of conversion process of this hook or this passion that you've built over many years, a lot of that takes place through certainly to some extent the common application personal essay and the activities list to some extent. But in the most specific form, it really occurs in the school specific essays and sort of the why you want to go to this school, and particularly why you want to study this particular field. That's where a lot of the school specific references are going to occur. That's where you're going to take that passion, that hook, and you're going to actually translate it into what it would look like at that university, right? So I do want to just differentiate. A lot of people confuse a major with a hook. A hook is again, it's more of a narrative or a general through line, and it could be calibrated or recalibrated or, sort of differentially calibrated at different institutions. That's another important thing to keep in mind. Some schools will not actually offer a business major. They do not have an undergraduate business school, and there is no formal business offering. You can't graduate with a degree in business. And so it is important to differentiate between a hook, sort of an overall umbrella, versus specifically a major, as we'll get into. And then finally, there are going to be some runners up here in terms of the actual sort of second place, third place finishers in terms of worst majors, or sort of worst hooks to apply under. So those are going to be computer science, engineering, anything tech related, bio, pre-med. These would be some runners up, but they actually didn't make the cut for the worst major, which is going to be business here. I will sort of just put it flat out, the worst major for getting into a top college, and I will go on to list 9 different reasons here, or explain 9 different reasons. The worst major for getting into a top college is applying as a student with a business hook, or applying for a business major, or anything that would be adjacent to a general business hook. So let's get into it. Why is business such a disadvantaging sort of hook or a way of positioning yourself for a top college? So number one, it is not particularly unique. It's highly competitive. A lot of people are interested in business. That is mainly due to sort of the career income, the prestige, just the societal availability bias, what's in front of everybody's eyes in terms of, earning potential. It's particularly difficult and competitive if you are an overrepresented minority. So if you're Asian Indian, and then it's also going to be a bit more competitive if you're a male, particularly if it's an aspect of business that skews a little bit more male dominant, such as finance versus something like marketing that might skew a little bit more female dominant. But if you're a male, it's not as bad as, engineering per se. Business is a little bit more equitable, or even in terms of the distribution, it's probably more like 60-40 male versus female if you sort of collapse across all the different subdomains of business. But it is still going to be a little bit more disadvantaging, particularly if you are a male. And then if you're an Asian Indian male, even a little bit harder, though also even if you're an Asian Indian female or male. But just in general, regardless of the sort of nuances in terms of sort of the applicant's demographics, it is just a much more common, much more competitive area because it's just very popular and oversubscribed, right? And again, this isn't just a matter of whether the school has an actual business major. Whatever the hook is, and it could be business, it could be business adjacent, it could be econ, whatever it is. There is a certain frequency at which, or according to which, the admissions officers at these top colleges are going to see a narrative or a hook that is similar or in the vicinity of business that is going to be a very high frequency, right? And so a lot of admissions just boils down to scarcity and uniqueness and, sort of being rare and having a story that is different from that of other applicants, right? And so it doesn't even really matter whether there's a business major or an economics. It doesn't really matter. It is just this student has interests that are business economics-esque, and that angle is going to be a lot more common at just colleges in general, but particularly at the top colleges. It's going to be a compounding layer of difficulty because it is already very difficult to get into a top and highly selective college by definition. But now you're adding difficulty on top of it, and you're decreasing your scarcity or your rarity in the applicant pool because you are selling them on a hook or an admissions narrative that is very common and that they're going to be seeing in a lot of other students' applications as well, right? So it's not just a matter of is it a major, it is a narrative that is very common. So that's the first issue, sort of the competitiveness, the non-uniqueness of business. Second, is there's just going to, as a consequence, be a much higher bar, for getting in, under a business narrative or as a business major, especially if you're talking about direct admit business programs, right? So a direct admit program would be sort of you're going in as a freshman, and you need to be directly admitted. You're being directly evaluated for being a business major, particularly if there's an undergraduate business school, for example, Wharton at Penn, Ross at Michigan. In these cases, it is puts a very significant weight on your candidacy, that you have a much higher bar versus another student whose hook is at a top line level, a lot more unique, right? So if you're trying to be the next Aristotle, a little bit easier to get into a top college as a philosophy major and just a philosophy narrative and a philosophy hook than it's going to be if you're trying to be the next Rockefeller or, whoever it is. It is just harder in terms of, applying because you also, if you're talking about direct admit programs, especially for direct admit programs, you need to be ready to go by freshman year, basically. That's what you're being directly admitted for, right? And so, particularly for students interested in business who also want to go to a top college, particularly, you need to really start working probably even earlier than other students might need to. you need to really build out a niche under the business umbrella because the top line positioning, as I refer to it, that's sort of like what the overall umbrella is a lot less unique than it would be for a student who, again, maybe is doing philosophy, where, they don't have to sort of, dig into a really specific niche like philosophy of mind or, philosophy of language, because philosophy just in and of itself is not very popular in terms of the top colleges. But if your business, your top line positioning is very popular, very competitive, very oversaturated. And so you really, 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 in order to stand out, have to really slam into a vertical and a niche. Or I've also mentioned it's sort of, you could look at this two ways visually as sort of like, drilling super deep vertically into a very specific niche, a very specific audience, very specific product, service, some, very particular, maybe interdisciplinary theme, or you can sort of look at it as lateral positioning, which is sort of bringing in something else, maybe again, another discipline, something that will make it very unique that you can combine it with. Maybe it's performance arts. Some students will combine it with, psychology, or they're interested in psychology, something else. You need to really justify the uniqueness a lot more if you are planning on being under the general business umbrella, and it puts, again, a lot more pressure on uniqueness, right? So there's a much higher bar here. It puts greater pressure on starting building your candidacy a lot earlier, being a lot more niche under the business domain, and then you just need to be a better overall candidate. It puts more pressure on your entire candidacy, your course rigor, your grades, right? Being number 5 in your class or top 5 in your class versus being top 20 in your class, having 10 APs versus 7 APs. It just puts pressure, your test scores, right? More important to be a 1580 than to be a 1520 because you're applying under one of the hardest areas to get into the college for. So you just have to understand that. And again, especially if you're an overrepresented minority, and even more so, again, especially if you are a male as well, there's going to be a little bit more pressure applied in those particular niche cases, right? So you are making the bar for your candidacy a lot higher. And you just have to understand that, and you need to be prepared well in advance. We talk about starting this process, very early if you want to be a competitive candidate at top colleges, but this is pushing it, even in a more extreme direction, which you need to be, you to be starting even earlier than just the average candidate, because you just have a much higher bar to clear. Number 3, strategic positioning. So strategic positioning is different from hook building, at least as we sort of use these terms. So strategic positioning is sort of the final late stage form of the hook, in the way that you are presenting it to the colleges when you're actually applying. And it refers to how you're presenting the hook at each college on basically an individual college by college basis, right? So that is sort of the final way that you're taking the hook or the overall narrative that you built, and you're sort of selling it or presenting it at each school, what it would look like in terms of what you would study at that particular school, because that's going to change, right? For business, there's a whole bunch of different programs, ways of getting into business. There might not even be a business program. And so you have to constantly recalibrate that at each school, and sort of take your hook and sort of represent it, right? Each one of those schools. And so that's strategic positioning. And strategic positioning for business is very complex because there's a whole host of, business programs, structures, the way that they admit students. And so you have direct admit, you can get in as a freshman. You have deferred admit, maybe you apply, going, into sophomore year, for example. So you sort of maybe take some core classes or some pre-business courses in freshman year, and then you apply in, as a sophomore, for example. You have no business program possibly at all. Like there might not literally be anything that's called business whatsoever at the college. And then maybe you're like an econ major or something that's, closely related, or maybe you just apply for something else. Maybe it's not even econ at all or business at all. Then there are some schools where, maybe you can take some undergraduate classes and it's like kind of a certificate minor esque thing where like you could take 3 classes in it in the business school. And so it's just very complex. And you need to know how to package it correctly based on the college that you're applying to. And then you also have different committees. Is this Wharton? There's a separate, entirely different school, an entirely different admissions committee. That requires a different level of understanding of the process and, how you're sort of presenting it and how they evaluate applicants versus arts and sciences. You need to really understand what you're doing in terms of presenting it based on the sort of unique school by school structures and different admissions processes, etc. It also provides more complexity and potential strategic liabilities. For example, if you're really interested in business and you really wanna go to a top, flight business program, and so maybe you're interested in a public flagship like UNC, for example, that maybe has a really good business program, but they don't offer ED, there's state residency considerations, maybe you're an out-of-state applicant, and so, because you have to do business and the business program, this now introduces a lot of other strategic liabilities because maybe you're not a North Carolina, resident, and there's the 8218 rule in terms of favoring in-state applicants. You also don't have ED, early decision there, so you don't get that typical odds boost on your odds of getting in. And so it may hurt your odds because you lose some of these other strategic benefits, or you're now sort of almost volunteering yourself for certain strategic liabilities just because you're sort of over indexed on business. It's just very complex from a strategic positioning perspective and sort of the other interfaces, interactive factors strategically that it sort of combines with. Again, sort of like ED, state residency, just general sort of, other factors of sort of the overall institution, your unique demographics. And so when you sort of put more constraints on a candidacy, for example, a student who's much more flexible and they can just go into the arts and sciences college and they can apply for whatever they want. We can position this in 18 different ways. Anytime you're putting more strategic constraints on a candidacy, you're straining the potential outcomes because now you have something else you have to take into account versus a student who just is much more flexible. And so they just have much more optionality in terms of making use of ED or whatever it is, right? And so more constraints can end up with worse outcomes. Number 4, it doesn't make sense at a lot of top colleges, the business narrative, because there is no business at the college per se, right? There might be economics, right? There's going to be economics at pretty much every single college, and the arts and sciences, the main liberal arts college. But there are top colleges where there is no undergraduate business school, there is no separate evaluation process for business applicants, and there may not even be anything called remotely business. You may need to understand that liberal arts academic ethos, you need to be able to differentiate between the type of candidacy that you actually built and the academic ethos of the institution, understand how to sort of correctly translate it. And if you don't understand how to sort of package it correctly, again, it can be a liability for your candidacy. But you do need to understand there are some potentially very bad risk reward scenarios. So, for example, another one that we discuss as being pre-med, you're not applying for medical school at age 18 unless you're doing a BSMD program, right? So the risk to your candidacy is you basically have just come up with a very common hook and a very common narrative. It is a liability to your candidacy by virtue of its non-uniqueness. And so that's what you lose, but you don't stand to gain anything because you can't get into medical school when you're 17 or 18, right? Because there is no medical school when you're 17 or 18. Again, setting aside the very small number of BSMD programs, right? But those do not apply to the vast majority of students. Most students are just trying to get in as an undergraduate and then apply to medical school later on, right? And the same thing applies for business to some extent as well. There may not actually be any real necessity of you positioning for business at that college because there is no undergraduate business school, there is no business committee, there is no business offering. And so all you really did was just create a very common hook and a very common narrative, and it doesn't really matter anyway. That is another issue. It just doesn't make sense that a lot of top colleges don't actually have a business program, right? And so you inherit a lot of the liabilities without it actually being necessary, inheriting potentially some of the upsides, right? And you need to be able to see how this all comes together. You need to be able to see the end before you start, right? And a lot of people, because it's very complex, they can't see how this all comes together and sort of compute what this looks like at a bunch of different colleges. And, it is just a lot more complex. Number 5, some business people may not like to hear this, but compared to some of the other very oversubscribed, very popular areas such as computer science, engineering, I would say those in particular, A lot of business kids lack one of the most valued traits at the top colleges, which is intellectual vitality. They don't really exude that sort of, like love for research or love of learning that a lot of other kids do in other domains. So when you're talking about engineering students or sort of more classically STEM or CS, they have their own issues, right? And those issues are they're also in very popular oversaturated fields. If you're a boy, even worse off for you. If you're Asian Indian, even worse off for you. One of the issues with CS or engineering is it invites a lot of applicants who basically have had this passion for a very long period of time, and there are a ton of activities and competitions and awards and science research programs to pursue, robotics clubs, etc. And so it just really raises the competition in those fields. But that being said, those students don't typically lack intellectual vitality, right? A lot of those kids are interested in engineering. They've been, it's like the sort of the cliche, I've been like building Legos or taking apart my computer and rebuilding it since I was 6 years old, right? And the problem is you're competing against a bunch of other kids who've also been taking apart their computer and rebuilding it since they were 6 years old and building things as a hobby, right? Since they were 6 or 8 or 10 or whatever it is for a long time, right? And then compounding the skill set in that field for a very long period of time is what makes it very competitive, right? That being said, at least a lot of those students have a very high degree of intrinsic motivation and they've built that up over a very long period of time, right? A lot of kids in engineering and STEM fields and computer science are very intrinsically motivated, right? They really, it's like cool to build things and make things and program things. And so those domains, while a potential very significant strategic liability and very competitive, at least the students have a very high degree of intrinsic passion for them. And so they get sustained by virtue of all the rewards that they experience along the way because it's cool to build things, it's cool to program things, and you get a bunch of rewards. They're not really, as extrinsically motivated, which is a tends to be a liability. Because the person who really loves what they're doing and gets a lot of short-term benefits will just do it longer and to a much greater extent. It unlocks a lot more discretionary effort than somebody who is purely extrinsically motivated, right? And so for a lot of business kids, they are just much more extrinsically motivated. It is a lot more transactional, right? And they're sort of thinking about it just in terms of, career potential, income, and sort of brand name firms that, sort of recruit from the top colleges. And it tends to just produce a lot lower intellectual vitality kids, and that is not good for a lot of the top colleges because this is one of the traits that they value the most. So if you're going to go down this very difficult path of business, you better make sure you're in it for the right reasons, and that they can come across in your application because if it doesn't come across in the right way, it is a major liability. And the other thing you have to really take into account, if you don't actually really love it or enjoy what you're working on, it is very hard to build over multiple years, right? And so there is that sort of lower intellectual vitality trait that just tends to be more common in business students versus students in some other areas that, while also very competitive, they do attract a lot of very intrinsically motivated students who have no issue building a passion or a focus for 3, 4 years, because a lot of them building it for 10 plus years, right? So you do have to understand that as a strategic liability. A lot of people discount it because it's just an abstraction, right? You tell somebody, "Oh, this is going to be hard," but it's just like abstract. They don't really understand because they don't see the other person who has the full unlock of all the discretionary effort because they really, really, really enjoy what they're working on. And so it is very important that if you're going to do business, you have a high degree of motivation and enjoyment and intrinsic drive, or there's some aspect of business, something whatever it's that you're working on, where you really love that thing, and business is just simply the shell or the toolkit for sort of helping you get that thing out to the world or disseminating that value, that service, that product, whatever it is. And business is just a vehicle. It's just a tool. It is not really, you can study it, but it's not physics, right? It's not an irreducible discipline in the same way. It is really a toolkit for selling, marketing, distributing, et cetera, some fundamental product or service that is in and of itself value to an audience and to the world. You need to really fall in love with that. Number 6, it's not as flexible in terms of positioning as I sort of alluded to before. So if you're interested in being pre-med or going to medical school or being pre-law and going to law school, you don't need to tell the college that at 18 years old, right? You're not going to medical school, you're not going to law school at age 18. Those will be graduate schools later on. For law school, it's for everybody, right? There is no combined, BA, or BS JD program, right? In the United States, at least. In the United States, there is a BSMD track, but again, it's for a very, doesn't apply to most students. Most students are not actually doing that. Pre-med and pre-law are a lot more flexible, right? You might have built a hook that is sort of, yeah, like it could be related to law, but it doesn't have to be related to law. You don't need to position yourself in that way. Like if you did debate, for example, yeah, you could just do like, political science and sort of tell them that you're pre-law, but there's also a million different topics in debates, and you could pull out any one of those and just reposition yourself and build a different candidacy so that you have absolute flexibility in terms of positioning yourself for the arts and sciences college, because it doesn't make a difference. You're not applying to law school at 18 anyway. And so for pre-med and pre-law, you have basically a ton of flexibility. You can study basically anything you want. In the arts and sciences college, you could study 50 different majors and combine them in whichever way you want. And so it's a lot more flexible from a strategic perspective versus business. So that is another liability. And then particularly if you're talking about direct admit programs, you just lose, all of that flexibility, to sort of spin it however you want in the way that might be sort of the most optimal at the end of the line. Number 7, and this relates to sort of a lot of business students are just simply lower intellectual vitality. And so I mentioned sort of 2 archetypes in terms of students. There's sort of the intellect and there's the doer, or you could call the thinker and the doer, I guess would maybe be the more natural juxtaposition. The thinker is more sort of very cerebral. They're more in their head. They're higher introversion. They're more curious. They would read books for fun by themselves. The business student tends to be more the doer. They're more interpersonal. They get more leverage out of people, leadership. They don't like doing research as much. And this is another liability from a strategic perspective. These students, because they tend not to be the thinkers or the very high intellectual vitality students, they don't really like research as much. And the way that research is typically construed by most high schools is a science research, even though research is sort of domain general, and you could do research in business as well. A lot of these students, just because it's less common, they don't see it as often to do business research. They don't actually pursue research in business, and also because they just are not really as much the thinker archetype or the very high intellectual vitality archetype. They don't like research as much, right? So, this is another liability because research is one of the highest value extracurriculars for college. It is not intrinsically high value. It depends on what you do with it and the contributions that you make and what the project is and how niche it is and how interesting it is and what you can add to it and over what time span but it has high value, a lot of high value propensity and potential. And a lot of business students don't want to do research, and they're too conditioned by a lot of the high schools and a lot of people to think that research is not for business students when you can do business research. Just a lot of students sort of gravitate towards it. And it's not really presented to them, right? And so we have students in our program who've done research in business, and it's extremely differentiating. It helps their candidacy, and because a lot of the students that they're competing against will not do it, and they don't gravitate towards it, or it's not presented to them, and they don't really know how to pursue it in the context of a typical traditional high school research program, because it's not really set up for business students as much as it is for more classic STEM students. We sort of have to add a different structure and support there outside of their high school and sort of show them very specifically how to package it and how to pursue it, but it has a lot more upside by virtue of the fact that most students will not do it who are in business, right? And that's what makes it more unique and more differentiating, right? However, that being said, for the general audience to which I'm talking, most people interested in business, they're not as high intellectual vitality. They don't gravitate to research as much as they do to maybe more interpersonal, very sort of, maybe like actionable or practical or sort of applied pursuits, almost by definition. Um, that is a liability because you miss out on, an extracurricular that is potentially very differentiating and has a lot of high value potential in research, right? The second thing is one of the most high value pursuits for business is, guess what? Building a business and scaling it, not just a business that gets the $300 in revenue a year, but that is actually looks like a pretty doesn't have to be, this is not doesn't need to be an adult level business, right? Or a business that, would be for, a top 1% individual who's 40 years old. But there's obviously a pretty big distinction between a student who has, $100 in revenue and a student who has 5,000, 10,000, 25,000, $50,000 maybe they've gotten up to number of products sold or services sold, how many people are on the team, does it have some complexity to it, some sort of organizational build out, et cetera, et cetera. And, so one of the highest value extracurriculars for being in student interest in business, of course, is going to be starting a business and actually taking it somewhere. It's sort of like, people who are interested in business are like, I don't want to do research. And, I also can't really, start and scale a business. It's like, okay, great. Well, then that puts a lot more pressure. It's like, well, you can't do this. You don't want to do that. But it's like you also have this major albatross basically, tied to your neck. And you have this huge bar that you need to clear and this major strategic liability, but, you're not willing to do this, you don't really gravitate towards it, and then you don't wanna do the really, like, extremely hard thing. You're just, like, shaking your head, right? It's like you're taking things off the table that would help you accomplish the goal, and you already to start have a very difficult goal to accomplish, right? Which, by the way, if you want to be a business student and go to a top business program, you volunteered yourself for. You volunteered yourself. You made it very difficult. You can't have it all ways. Everybody wants to have their cake and eat it too, because a lot of students who are interested in business, they're sort of already taking some high value vehicles off the board already just by virtue of their personality type. And then they already have a very strategically disadvantaging positioning strategy in the first place. You get compounding layers of sort of exposure or difficulty to their candidacy. Number 8, I already mentioned this, I sort of undercut this one a little bit, via number 5, which is just a lot of business kids are just naturally tend to be lower intellectual vitality. But again, business attracts a lot more extrinsically motivated students and a lot of transactional students. Not surprisingly, we're talking about business, not rocket science that it would attract a lot of very transactionally minded students or applicants, right? But it attracts a lot of students, again, who are just looking at income data, they're just looking at colleges and ROI, and I'm sorry, but Wharton doesn't wanna hear that you wanna go to Wharton to work in investment banking or private equity. I'm sorry, right? They don't care. It's not interesting. It's not compelling. It's not moving. It's not likable to hear, and it just looks like a transaction, right? What these top colleges want to hear from you is that you really enjoy something, you're very intrinsically motivated by it, you're very passionate, you have the evidence to support it, you want to come to this school, and you want to keep pursuing this area, and you want to do so surrounded by other very motivated, very intellectual, very driven peers who are also very aspirational, also want to take on very big problems. You want to collide with these other big thinkers, these big minds in these forums, in your classes, outside the classroom. That's what they want to hear. They don't care that you want to go work for Goldman Sachs. They don't care that you went and looked up what the recruitment rates are from all the colleges. And on LinkedIn, you saw the graphs of where McKinsey and Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley recruit from. They do not want to hear that. And if it even trickles into your applications, expect that they will reject you. That's not what they want to hear. And for the parents out there who also sort of approach the process that way, understand you are setting your student up in a lot of ways for potentially failure because if the colleges get wind of that very transactional nature of the application and getting in is just simply an ROI. And I get it. College is very expensive. And so it is illogical to view it from an ROI perspective. It's also, it's also takes time, right? It takes 4 years, hundreds of $1,000, etc. And a lot of parents sort of, want to know that their student's going to be successful and, can support themselves, etc. The problem is that if that comes across in the applications at all, or if that sort of um, really grips the student where many different just they have a multi-year process and it's all just extrinsically motivated. They just don't produce the same caliber of candidacies as students who are intrinsically motivated, right? And again, for the reasons that I mentioned, you don't unlock all this extra discretionary efforts that comes when you have all these short-term rewards because you really just enjoy what you're working on. And if you're sort of, thinking to yourself, okay, well, I do want to make a lot of money. I want to be in business. Find something that is business-esque that could be distributed, sold, marketed via a business, which is just a toolkit, right? It is not a irreducible domain, right? Business is not. Um, it is just a vehicle for providing value, right? It is not intrinsically, inherently, at some level, really the value itself. Find something that you're really passionate about, some product, some service, something that you can provide to people that is of value to an audience, to the world, something else, and build your business interests around that thing, right? A lot of people are aiming at a shell, right? Business is a bunch of the shell. You really need to think about, what is really at the heart of this, and maybe it's something, maybe it's something else. Maybe it's the business of sports. Maybe it's the business of who knows what it is. Maybe you have some other really weird hobby or some really weird passion, and you want to think about it, differently, not aiming for business, but how can I turn this into a business, right? As sort of a distribution or delivery vehicle for sort of taking my passion for this thing. If you sort of view business as a framework, it is a very powerful framework to see life through, selling and marketing, right? What are you doing in a lot of this process? You are selling yourself to the colleges, and you want that to sort of be very effortless, and you want to sort of, try to make this as, authentic and, genuine in a lot of ways. But there is salesmanship here, right? People present their narrative, and can sort of sell it better and personally brand better, etc. Will do better than the students who can't. It's helpful to sort of see it, I think, as a framework and as a vehicle, because I think that maybe can get some students who do have some other interesting hobby or passion, who do want to maybe translate it to the business domain, and you get sort of the benefits of their intrinsic motivations, while also probably some of the extrinsic reasons that you want to pursue business. And so you maybe get a little bit of the best of both worlds. You have to be very careful of, again, making it too extrinsically minded. And you have to be very wise, particularly over very long time courses. If the student needs to build their candidacy over, many years, and it needs to be a really great candidacy if you want to go to a top college for business for the reasons that I've already articulated, it needs to be an absolutely top-notch candidacy. You need to find something where you're motivated to work on it on a Friday night from 9 p.m. to midnight, right? And if you're just doing it because you looked up the, 5-year post, bachelor's median salary, or what the percentage recruitment rate is, at Wharton for Morgan Stanley, you're just not going to be working for those 4 hours or those 3 hours, right? A lot of students can't. They want to convince themselves they can do it. And there are people who can still grit and grind, and they can still do it purely for extrinsic reasons. You're just not going to beat somebody who just, has the combination of them, or is just really intrinsically motivated to do it because they get all the short term benefits as well. One of the famous lines, I mentioned this on one of the podcasts, which was the application, strategy for a high school senior episode that we did. That's it was sort of potentially considering doing business and doing engineering, and they were very late in the game and had to sort of like try to pull together. And one of my favorite quotes is from John Doerr, who has given one of the largest donations to any top college. I think only $2 billion plus donations. Michael Bloomberg to Johns Hopkins and John Doerr to Stanford to set up an entirely new school there for sustainability at Stanford. And John Doerr, one of the things that he sort of talked about in terms of, picking, founders, people be successful in Silicon Valley, et cetera, was the missionary versus mercenary mindset. One of my favorite quotes there was, he said, mercenaries are motivated by the lust for making money. Missionaries, while recognizing the importance of money, are fundamentally driven by the desire to make meaning. A lot of the top colleges, a lot of people who, are looking, are investing and looking at founders, etc. They are going to look at, how compelling is this story? Would I place a bet on this person to be successful in this area, in this business when things get very difficult? because pain and suffering are fixed costs of ambition and of life. So you need to pick a goal that is a net worth suffering for, because that is inevitable. And so when you're picking people, right, you're picking a founder or business to invest in. Who's more likely to be successful? Of course, it's going to be the person who has the intrinsic love, the joy. Maybe they created the business, whatever it is, because they experienced that problem themselves, so they understand it extremely well. There's a deep personal connection to it. I've talked about this in other podcasts, right? That's what creates a really compelling narrative, when you have both the ability, but you also have a very deep emotional connection to what you're working on. Because, between the person who has just the talent, or the person who has the talent plus that narrative, which is already in of itself extremely compelling, that story, the person who has all the emotional tie-ins is just much less likely to sort of give up and surrender when things get very difficult. You need to really take this into account, particularly if you are younger and building a narrative and a missions hook that is potentially going to be business relevant. You need to really be very honest with yourself, not lie to yourself, and you need to understand there are people out there where, while you're not working, they are working because they really fundamentally love what they do, right? And you need to be very honest and introspective about that. Because business does tend to attract, and because a lot of parents push their kids into business because of these extrinsic transactional rewards, you just need to understand they also present strategic liabilities. And when we interview students for our program, I can look at a student and say, I know this student's going to break. I know where they're going to give up. I know we're not going to get the discretionary efforts because they're too extrinsically motivated. And so I know they're just not going to be obsessive about building this thing, and you're not going to get all of that bonus energy and bonus efforts. And I can literally see those not, I mean, they don't even have to be breakdowns. I can see breakdowns where just sort of, they sort of try to cut a corner, or because they just don't really enjoy it, right? They're just doing it for something else. They're doing it for what it gets them, not for the thing itself. You can see those breakdowns, the sort of, not wanting to do the thing, and then you have to push them and pull them through the mud. But what I can also see even more is I can see in my head the student who's currently in our program, or the prospective student who will be in our program. They will unlock all of that extra energy because they just love what they're doing, and you just get so many more hours out of the week and so much more bang for your buck because they just truly enjoy working on it. And it is more effortful for them to stop working on it than it is for them to start working on it, which is the extrinsically driven kid. So just understand that. Last factor here that makes business, in my opinion, the worst major or hook or positioning strategy for going to a top college strategically, high parent influence, right? So a lot of parents try to influence their students into this domain for reasons that I've already articulated and for reasons that are probably fairly obvious to everyone. That can come across potentially in the applications. Again, this sort of forcefulness, or this transactionality. Parents sometimes have adjacent backgrounds. They come from business backgrounds. I mentioned this in our application red flags episode, how to sort of handle some of these potentially negative and strategically disadvantaging optics in the application. But that could be another liability for the student. You have parents with business backgrounds. It's not really clear. Did the student come up with this on their high agency, or is this the parents coming up with this? It might look like unfair advantages. The student's resume might be a consequence of their parents' sort of unfair advantages or connections, which seems great as a parent to sort of give your student the benefit of those connections, but it all could be very transparent to an admissions officer, and it looks very non-equitable compared to students who don't have those resources or opportunities, and also potentially who, without those resources and opportunities and connections, actually got to the same place as your students, which is much more impressive, and they might have even gotten past. Right. And particularly if they really love business or whatever it is that they're building related to business as well. So you get a lot of this sort of like parent adjacency, transparency of sort of parental influence, pushing the kid. Again, you're pushing them into a path many years out from the application where you're not going to get all this leverage by virtue of the fact that the student is genuinely passionate about building this thing, and you're going to be pulling them through the mud. And I could save you a lot of pain and heartache and tell you it's not fun. right? When you have to drag a student over multiple years because they don't just fundamentally enjoy what they're doing. As I mentioned, you get this transparent involvement potentially. The business looks a little suspicious. It looks a little too good to be true potentially, or there's some signals that somebody else is sort of involved or comes across in the activities. And so there's just a lot of potential liabilities here, particularly in business. Not a lot of parents pushing their kids into being philosophy majors. That is it for this episode, in which we unpacked why business, at least from a strategic perspective, when you are trying to get into and get admitted to one of the top and most highly selective colleges, why it has a lot of disadvantages and potential stumbling blocks along the way. There are some other fields, as I mentioned, that are close runners up, but for a lot of the reasons that we've articulated, I think business is probably the hardest, and again, has a lot of potential landmines associated with it that you at the very least need to be aware of. If not, make sure that you successfully navigate around if you are interested in this particular path. That is it for this episode, and we'll talk and see you soon in the next one. Bye bye.